Welcome to the Meta Season 36 version. If this is your first time listening to or watching this show, welcome. This is basically about reviewing the current status of the GAC meta. Once per season, currently, is how we do it. Sort of what's going on in the past season, what I think will happen in the future seasons, the future season, the upcoming season. What characters, units, teams, mods, datacrons, etc., are popular or will become popular, and how they influence the meta. And in particular, I'm looking at the competitive side of the meta. So by that, I mean players who are trying to win more than they lose in general, and or get into Kyber 1. That's sort of how I describe. Obviously, Kyber 1 is a roster check, but there's tens of thousands of players who could be in Kyber 1 if they had the time, effort, attention, desire, etc. So, well, there's not tens of thousands of players. Roster-wise there is, but with the squish happening. Anyway, it's a whole different thing. So it's aimed at Kyber 1 competitive players and people who are competitive in any other league and trying to become more gooder. Who am I? Why should you care what I have to say? So I'm like 11 or 11 and a half now million GP player. I've been in the top of Kyber, the top 10 to 100, depending on my available time and interest, ever since it's been there. But more importantly for the show, I watch a huge amount of GAC fights. So I watch a ton of videos, mostly for the counters tool at grindarenascience.com, but also because for me, that's the best way for me to learn and get better. So I see a lot of what's happening, what people choose, their explanations of why they choose it, and I look at a lot of numbers and stats on GG and other places. So anyway, welcome back again. So the format that I use here is 4 main areas: 3v3, 5v5 ships, and like an overall game state sort of discussion. And with the 3v3 and 5v5 and ships to some extent, I'm always looking at those metas with the current 2 active datacron sets. So that's all I look at every month. So every month it'll be a little bit different for the next game mode coming up. So for example, on this upcoming 3v3 mode, set 7 is brand new, and the combination of set 6 and 7 is new together. For next season with with the 5v5 coming up, both set 6 and set 7 and how they work together will be sort of a little bit more known, but it'll be the first 5v5 with both of them. So, yeah, I'm splitting that way because of Datacron's work. I'm keeping ships. Ships doesn't change as much from season to season. It mostly changes when there are new units available in ships. Some new gear levels or something in the game that changes how ships work. But that's part of the things I include. So let's get in straight to it and talk about 3v3 and this combination of DCs. So every 3v3 season, for the last 2, this one and the one before, because that's when they changed it, it's the first time that we see a new datacron set with very little or no chance to see it before competitively before the season starts. So for instance, there will be at least 1 sort of 2 territory wars for people to try out set 7. But in those cases, especially in the 3v3 season, there's not really that much testing you can do in territory wars, besides the fact that territory wars has many different interactions. There's really no place to test 3v3. 5v5 you can test in arena, there's no place to test 3v3. So the first week of 3v3 ends up being a lot of, well, let's see if this works. Or it worked in the last 3v3 season, let's see how much this new Datacron changes it. However, there are some things that I think I can predict for this 3v3 season. Now that we know what the next Datacron set is, of course, and we know obviously what left with set 5. And we're very experienced with set 6. So, number 1, Jabba is going to be a lot easier to kill. I'm talking primarily about 3v3 here. I'll talk about Jabba and 5v5 sets again in a month when we talk about the 5v5 season coming up. But without the turn meter gain and ult charge from set 5 DC for Jabba, he's going to be easier to kill in general. The counters that were like little on the edge before are not going to be that way now. They'll be much more reliable. The actual DC that people want to use with him is a great question. I think that especially in 3v3, the smuggler version of set 7 that has retribution, that means Jabba and probably Bushlia, because you'll have her in there. Not Kursistan, which is a bit of a downer, but still, I think that's a pretty good, like, stack a lot of armor and give their retribution to him. That'll probably be the most annoying to deal with, but it's still not going to be as bad as any of the set 5, any of the 2 set 5 Datacrons we had at level 9. The CLS, C3, and Chewpio, which is sort of falling by the wayside the last few 3v3 seasons, is going to be back when you have the Chewpio level 9 Datacron. Not just for the stacking offense, which is sort of slower in 3v3. It'll still happen quite a bit, but more because of the protection regeneration when Chewpio uses basic. So it's going to be much harder for the burst damage type teams to get through them. Some people who have been using, I mentioned here, Troopers, Iden, and JTR. Troopers may still work. It's not going to be quite as easy because anybody with a level 9 will take their Chewpio to at least Relic 7. And many Chewpios now are Relic 5 or Relic 6. Relic 6, I think, is most common. And if they take him to Relic 7, maybe they'll take him to Relic 8 so they can use him in Rise of the Empire TB. He's pretty good in that. So I think Troopers are going to, they still are going to stand a chance of working, but it's going to be much more Datacron reliant than before, because if you have a Chewpio Datacron, it's going to have a lot more stats than what most people would generally put on the previous Datacron. Anyway, it's not that it's going to be suddenly impossible to beat. It's just going to be one notch higher in difficulty. Vandor Chewie's L9. I'm not a big fan of his L9 in the general thing. In 5s, I think Qi'ra is a much better fit for that team. But especially in 3s, having his L9 I think is going to be great. That's going to be very nice. And depending on if you're running him an offense or defense, because he can sort of spam his special, and if you put him with like Dash, him, and young Lando Calrissian, who has a targeted ability too, if you have the level 6 where you sort of stack when you target another ally, that's going to be an even more powerful team. So this, I think, is a strong fit for 3s. Not a big fan of 9s, a fan of 9s and 5s. Afra's going to be more annoying just because there's more of her. She had the best defensive record in the last 3v3 season. I don't think she'll have quite that record. Here, it may sound like I'm contradicting myself. I don't think she'll have quite the defensive record in this season of 3v3s, because everybody should have a good set 6 DC to take care of her. It's Han and Chewie and a Rebel or Scoundrel or something. With L6, where you get 100% bonus TM on basic, so Han can take 2 turns. But more people are going to have Afra in general, so there'll be more just putting her on defense, regardless of what Datacron she has, if she has the level 9, of course. Regardless of the level 3 and level 6, she's going to be very difficult to take out. And more people, I think, will struggle against her than know the counter to her very well. J&K kills her 100% of the time, but do you really want to give up J&K against Afra? She's going to be annoying, I think, for many people. 40 or 50 RT is level 9. In 5s, extremely powerful. In 3s, also extremely powerful. In a way, it's almost more difficult in 3s to get a high damage team that's either going to be able to focus her down or to be able to kill the side characters twice before they regain spare parts. So I think in 3 she's going to be incredibly annoying. The exact like best combination of units for her, I don't know, whether you're playing for timeout or damage. Timeout probably is the easiest way to go. However, the sort of plus side of this is that she's unlikely to be in the Ray, Ben, Shorty teams, which were very annoying last season. So the silver lining, but she's going to be a pain, sure. Of course, you have to take her up to Relic 7, which for some people is a bit of a stretch with all the changes coming up. Oh, and you know what? I forgot to start the video in the background. It's by Ginger Jesus, who is a pretty good player, has some good videos. Sorry, that's a while now. 10 minutes of listening to me without watching stuff. Anyway, got some good stuff. His YouTube channel is Ginger Jesus, all one word. So, back to the 3v3 stuff. I also think I mentioned here that young Han Solo, not young Lando Calrissian, but Han Solo, his level 9 DC, in 3s especially, I think could be extremely annoying because he stacks a lot of defense, health steal, and damage. I don't think it's quite going to be at the Hondo level, but sort of close to Hondo. And it's unclear by looking even at the GG text where his damage stacks to 200%, but it doesn't say anything about the limit for his defense stacking. We'll see. Maybe it stacks at 200% also. Regardless, if he takes a few turns with Retribution, I think it's Retribution that he needs to be able to stack. He's going to be very annoying to deal with. Resistance as a whole is going to be pretty strong too. Ray with Retribution, or the damage immunity, critical immunity rather. Level 6, both of those are going to be annoying. Zori, Sana's not resistance, I know, but there's going to be some strong teams in the resistance area. So, oh yeah, one other thing here. I do see levels set 7 rather as sort of a more defensive, and maybe not even more defensive, as less offensive. There's not a lot of really strong offensive Datacron mechanics in this set. So I think most people will be using set 6 for offense, with some exceptions, obviously. But even the level 9s in general, the AI can play most of the level 9s very easily. It's not like set 5 where it's a lot more, I mean, some of them the AI can play just fine. But set 6 maybe is a better example, where the AI, most of the DCs, the AI doesn't play super well. Whereas set 7, the AI will play them pretty well because there's not a lot of, you don't have to choose a lot of stuff for the DC abilities to be really good. So that I think is going to be interesting, and definitely a change from set 6. But more passive. If anything, I would say set 7 is more relaxed. Yeah, there's ones that are going to be good that you'll probably be requested from your territory war officers, but in general, there's not nearly as many that are extremely useful, and especially not in the level 3. I think set level 6, there's some awesome ones that can make or break a lot of fights. But still, it's a lot easier to get level 6s than level 9s. So, what is going on in the 5v5 meta? I'm actually not going to talk so much about the 5v5 meta, because it will sort of only be tested in arena and territory wars. So for GAC players, it doesn't really make a great deal of difference now. I think in a week or two, once more things have been seen, then it'll be more interesting. So certainly next month, I'll talk about this more often. But I do want to talk about 2 interesting concepts from the past season, which was 5v5, that I found interesting and made me pay attention a little bit more to how things are, to different aspects of how things change in GAC. So the great swap here is one of them. I looked at the top 50 players in Kyber 1 um, in week 1 versus week 3. And if you look at the amount of times that Java was used on offense, it's very small, like 4 or 5%, 3 or 4% maybe, less than 10%, and a little bit different in each round. But by the end of week 3, at the end of the season, it was not quite 50%, like doing like 37 or 38%, something like that. When players use Java, they use them on offense rather than him being on defense. However, this is only when I can see that a Java was fought on defense. Like if a player placed Java on defense and it's in the back wall and never got attacked, I have no clue. So maybe this number is, for sure, it's not 100% accurate. But in terms of what I looked at, Java really shifted to offense a lot. Mostly because of Afra, to be honest. Afra and SLK with the Hux DC, and JMK as well, you know. But because Afra killed Java so easily with very little risk, if somebody kept their Afra for offense, Java was sort of just nullified. There's no risk in it. And Afra kills a lot of teams, but for GL, like it was like Star Killer versus Ray, sort of. It was pretty easy without a lot of complexity involved. So people started shifting their Afras to offense, or the Javas to offense. And it's amazing how quickly it happens too. I mean, it's more and more people got Afra, so they understood, but like word spread, people paid attention, they scouted their opponents a little bit, looked at their defense, offense, talked to their guild. And I think in the top 50 especially, it's a pretty small community, you know. There's probably 200 players who sort of rotate in and out of the top 50 on a regular basis. So word gets around pretty quickly. There's only a limited amount of places they go for information and who they talk to. But what's also interesting, while less than 10% to almost 50 or almost 40% is a huge change, the fact that still more than half, the majority, didn't do anything. So even in the top 50, where you saw clever players, people who pay attention to what makes the most banners with the least risk, you know, people shift their Javas to offense. The majority of players still didn't. And these are, again, players in the top 50, like the tippity top. So just by making little changes like this can give you a big advantage, even in the top of the top. Very, very interesting. The second thing, this is what I called it, and I scribble it on a notepad. I've been doing this the last few months. The face punching square. So basically, this is the teams, and this is really mostly in 5v5 because it's more like a face punching octagonal shape in 3v3. It's a lot more complicated there. There's a lot more things that beat many things. Anyway, in 5v5 in particular, there's only a certain number of teams each season that can be beaten by one or with two teams, but usually only one team or none maybe, for very good banners, with a high chance of success. Like Afra is a great example of this. To beat Afra, you can use JMK, SLK, or CLS. CLS is okay banners, but not great. JMK is usually great banners. SLK is usually great banners. But those two are GLs at least. CLS is not great banners, but still a pretty good chance of success. And then I also put teams in this face punching square that can beat a large number of other teams for very high banners with a very high chance of success. I really don't know what to call this exactly in a technical way. To me, I guess you could call it high value teams, but calling it the face punching teams I found to be more entertaining to myself. And I base my whole defense and offense around these teams to make the most use of them, whether I put them all on defense to force my opponent to make choices which will not result in a one shot, or I keep them for offense or some mix depending on what I'm expecting the opponent to play or what other counters I have available and how many banners I expect to make. Um, for the last season, it was Afra, JMK, SLKR, and CLF, sort of all revolving around Afra, as you can see. And Jabba was actually on there in the beginning, but in the end, I didn't find Jabba. He was very easy to beat with at least a couple of teams for me, for my roster, for my Datacrons. And there was very little risk involved. Like, I knew that I could keep 2 teams for the back wall, and those 2 teams could beat any of the available 3 teams that possibly could be placed there. And then the 3rd team I could just pick apart if it was something, if it was another GL that I wasn't expecting or something. Anyway, it's an interesting concept, I think, that many people do. It's just, this is, for me, I would say this is what takes the most amount of my time when I'm preparing for my offense and defense, is figuring out what teams are the highest value that should be in this face punching square on my little notepad. So I am very curious to see how things change for this 3v3 season, because even though it's not 5v5, I still quite enjoy it. Allows a lot of testing. That's the part that I think I like the most. A lot of creative usage of teams. Like, I really think that some sort of Qi'ra L3 Young Han solo, that could be really interesting. Dash VC and Young Lando Calrissian could be really interesting. And those can beat, I think, some GL level teams. Maybe not the Young Han solo one, but could be some interesting possibilities here. And there'll be there's already videos on YouTube for, the Datacron level 9s for set 7, but in the coming few days there'll be more. So, ships meta. Yeah, last month I said it was not boring any longer. It's definitely not boring, or stale, I think might have been the word I used. It's definitely not stale any longer, but I think it's been figured out by and large. And again, this is for players who have everything, who have all of the ships, and highly geared pilots. So maybe 500 or 1,000 players are in this pool. For players without these, without all the ships available, or their pilots are like really 5 or something like that, it definitely makes a difference. But right now, for all of the ships, there's at least 1, usually 2 counters that are available with high chance of winning. It's just a question of how many banners you want to make. So in the beginning of this last season, there was people who were like, well, you know what, I'll put both Profanity and Executor on defense, and I'll keep Empire and First Order and so some people keep Home 1 Akbar, which was interesting. Because Profanity, even without the full normal lineup, is not an easy fleet to beat. Anyway, that was a very odd case, didn't really catch on. So I saw people that were going for like, you know what, I'll force my opponent to use the they'll have to kill my Profanity Executor, basically. And then depending on whether that opponent kept their Profanity Executor on offense or put them on defense. But I think after the first week, most people realized, if they hadn't already, that the banner differential is always in the favor of the player who keeps their Profanity and Executor on offense. So for instance, let's say you put Profanity and Executor on defense. Now you have a counter to either one of those that has a very high chance of success, but it's rarely going to make more than 70 banners. If you use your Profanity on their Executor and vice versa, you had the same very high chance of success, even higher really, depending on if you want to include some tech choices, and almost guaranteed you'll make more than 70 banners. So just from taking chance of success out of it, just banners alone, if you keep your Profanity Executor for offense, you'll average like 6, 7, 8 banners more than your opponent, depending on what fleets they place. So I think it's sort of figured out, like the vast majority of players just don't want to deal with ship RNG and keep them for offense. Just general better banners with less hassle. There are some players, however, who still like look at what their opponents failed at and check the gear levels very closely and make some creative ship defenses. But for the vast majority of players, I don't really the time you put into doing that. Just, get your 75, 72, and 70 on fleets. Call it good, very little RNG involved. Of course, as I said earlier, depending on your roster size, this may not be possible. Maybe you don't have the appropriate roster levels in Razor Crest to counter Profundity, for instance. So you have to use the Empire counter, which is with worse banners. And then you have the, which is not totally worse banner. 68 to 70, I think, is the average for the Empire counter to Profundity. Compared to Executor, that's usually 72, 73, 74 maybe, depending on which reinforcement you bring in. But also, like the lower relic level your Razor Crest, your Beskar Mandalorian is, the higher chance that it could just fail and it's done. So that's still definitely a consideration. Much more complicated at lower roster sizes. Enjoy this, watching Wampa. No longer do you have the Wampacron, the Dotprot DC. Yeah, it was good to know your Wampa. And I had this in here the last few times. Fleet is not RNG, contrary to what most people say. Fleet is extremely predictable and controllable. The problem is that the predictable and controllable parts of it are related directly to gear levels. Well, and mods, but the stats of the ships. And most videos you see and testing you see, people do not include the stats of their pilots or the exact ship stats, because that determines turn order, damage, health, protection, etc., etc. But if you do pay attention to that or test within a very specific window, ships are very predictable. So of course, there's some RNG parts. I'm not saying there's no RNG, but for the amount of people complain about RNG in fleets, don't do counters that require RNG. I mean, avoid those. That's how you lose GACs for things outside of your control. Whenever you can. Obviously, sometimes, your opponent outplays you or you make some dumb choices and you're left with some terrible options, all which have RNG, okay? But in general, best to avoid those. So, moving on to game state. Overall, what is the game state meta? And by that I mean, what are things happening in the game outside of GAC which affect GAC or could affect GAC? Overall, I think it's looking pretty good. The rise of the Empire, I think in this last 5v5 season, I saw quite a lot more tanks and support characters, mostly because the damage characters are already higher relic. But you see more Zalbar, Hermit Yoda, L3, etc., that are now Relic 7, Relic 8, or Relic 9, I guess, depending on your opponent and the opponent's skill, most. So I did see a few timeouts. In that case, the Ray plus tanks team was popular, higher up in GAC. I think even Aesop ran it a few times. So that's something I expect to see more and more of. In threes, it's definitely going to be there as well. Just that in threes, usually timeout is less common in threes some of the time, but also it's easier to be surprised in threes. So I think there'll be more whoops, how did that happen type of situation in threes. But yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm curious. I don't know for sure. I just know that in this last 5 season, it was very noticeable with tanks and some support characters being higher relic and being much more difficult to kill. So there's definitely some timeouts there. Yeah, it relates a bit to the set 7 DCs that I mentioned earlier. Like, there's not really an offensive DC set so much. A lot of the stats are uh, passive in nature, a little bit more defensive oriented. So I expect there's not as many strong offensive choices, is more an accurate way to say it. So I expect that to continue a bit in 3v3. And the Crate Dragon raid is also very interesting um, because they've already announced what the factions are. So you can look at which factions overlap in what you need for Rise of the Empire and what they've said will be used in the Crate Dragon raid. It's Mandalorians and Hub Cartel, pretty obvious. It's like easy winners. Jabba's still a great GL even without his Datacron. Mandalorians are fantastic. They don't have a specific Datacron, but they still have smugglers for set 6 for another 2 seasons, so it's going to be good. And even without the scoundrel Datacrons, it's a great faction. I think, and they said Tuscans are going to be. They said Tuscans are also coming up in an upcoming Datacron set, whether it's set 8 or beyond. I don't know. I would think set 8. I don't think the Crate Dragon raid is that far off, but who knows? Maybe it's set 9. And the team is actually quite powerful as well. In certain circumstances, like I think it'll be easy to beat on defense if you use the correct team. But well, I guess like anything, but can be a very sort of like an Iden like team on offense where it just totally shuts down some teams. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. I don't think it's strong in 3s though, to be honest. Yeah, I don't expect to see it much in 3s, but definitely in 5s, very nice. Yeah. Besides that, I mentioned this briefly in the end of the last meta, and I've seen this talked about, commented about, discussed in many places since then. Not just for GAC players, but I think it affects especially GAC because GAC does require a large amount of time if you want to take it seriously. It's just free time. With Conquest, raids are still there if you do Pit or Sith. TB, thankfully less overall time commitment, but still takes time. It's difficult for people to find free time to spend on GAC, and in a way, Datacrons have influenced this too. Like the main downside for Datacrons is if you really want to scout thoroughly your opponent, you have to look at their Datacrons. And because the Datacrons change so frequently, it's hard to know the impact of what all of them will be unless you spend a lot of time thinking, planning, theory crafting, reading, etc. So the side effect of this is that the value of scouting in general has reduced dramatically. And the amount of time available to scout has gone up, or the amount of time available to scout has gone down, and the time required to do the same level of scouting has gone up quite a bit. I still, to do a cursory scouting, like look at one of the bots or one of the various tools where you can just look at your opponent's, history, units, mods, blah, blah, blah. That takes 10 minutes maybe. Very easy. Everybody should do something like that. But really where the highest return on your time is, I think, is in the actual combat phase. Set your defense. Maybe you set your defense differently for certain opponents, but it doesn't really matter as much as having the correct mix of characters, teams, and Datacrons to beat any variety of teams which your opponent may set. Because if you just set your opponent or your defense or if you choose your offense based upon what you think your opponent will set, eventually you'll face a good opponent who changes their defense, and then you won't be able to beat it. Whereas if you set your offense on beating any possible combination of teams, not necessarily one-shots, but still keeping a flexible offensive array of teams and of Datacrons, you'll fare a lot better and spend less time in the whole preparatory phase, just spend your time on, okay, here's the team I have to beat. There's so many options now. And this is easier and easier as time goes on. As there's more and more teams, units available, the amount of teams we've had in GAC hasn't changed in a year and a half, 2 years maybe. It's been a while. So until that changes, I hope that changes or gets updated a bit in the future. It's easier and easier to keep a good variety of teams on offense that can beat anything. Even if it's all GLs and Aphra and Star Killer and all of that, you can still beat it on offense if you keep a good, smartly selected grouping of units based on different teams and Datacrons to support them. But to do even that takes a lot of time, and it's difficult to do with everything going on in the game these days. So I think that's the biggest challenge for GAC, just available time. It affects apathy too. If you can only spend an hour, and still it's a good amount of time, every 2 days to do your attacks, and you don't have time to do scouting or time to do research for each one of the particular teams you're going to fight, which takes it up to 2 hours. And you're not going to do well, be more apathetic about it, not want to engage in the game mode in general. So yeah, I see that the biggest issue for making GAC fun, keep people engaged. So wrapping it up all together, overall I'm pretty happy about what's going on. The latest territory battle I am a big fan of in terms of my time required. It's very little compared to even light side GOTV. I would say half the amount of total time. So that I enjoy quite a bit. And the fights I find more interesting, shorter, and there's at least one or two per planet that I like doing. I find them interesting. For now, who knows after 6 months. I like what I hear so far about the Great Dragon Raid. And again, if that gives me more time to play GAC or to do GAC related game stuff, then that's a win in my book. Whether it will or not is a great question. I don't know. But I think that would be cool. And to me, having both of these things change, the whole raid system changing and territory battles changing, where they're looking to reduce the required time from players or required time at certain times, makes me hopeful for Conquest. Something needs to change with Conquest so it's not as pressing the play button, 20 times a day after you finish the red box and you're just simming for materials. Not simming, I would love to sim for materials once I got red box. Anyway, yeah, that would be save a lot of time. And something to change, I think territory war needs it dramatically, because the concept of territory wars is cool. I enjoy fighting one group fighting another group. That concept is really cool. But because it's in a very set window, there's only a few people making choices for the whole team. So it's not like you can go on the map and choose any of the teams you want to fight and pick, the 3 teams that you have available that do a good job and then fight those at your leisure. You have to be available. Again, this is in competitive guilds, you have to be available at certain times when they're doing their attack, or you have to check in once every 2 or 3 hours to make sure that you don't miss using one of your teams that you need to use. And the point system is very archaic. It's nothing like GAC is now. It's just basically win or lose. Do you get 20 points or 19 in some rare cases, or do you screw up? There's really no incentive for playing well. It's just following the orders, and very few of the fights are actually technically challenging because, again, the officers who are choosing what teams to use are aiming for they're targeting the dumbest players in their guild. The worst, not dumbest, some dumb players would be great at GAC or TW, but they're choosing the lowest common denominator when they're creating their orders and choosing teams and stuff like that. So I just find it a very social part of it is nice, but the design part of it from a game perspective is terrible. So I hope they change that in some ways. I hope they change GAC a little bit too. Like now with preset defense, I don't think you need 48 or 24 hours to set your defense. Like change that to 12 hours and make the attack phase 36 hours or something like that. Like some way to expand the options for players would be great. I think also having some format change, maybe expanding teams. I'm not sure I like expanding teams necessarily because it's just more time required. And that's sort of like the main issue they're having. Maybe if they free up time in other game modes and then add it to GAC, I don't know. Or I wouldn't be surprised if they add an entirely new PvP game mode. Something that's much more like quick. You can do maybe not speed GAC, but along the lines where you have it done in an hour or less, basically. So anytime you want to fight somebody else, you want to compete, you can do some sort of quick game where you know go, hey, I'm looking for a game, whatever, and people can match you, or you get matched automatically, probably. And then there's some sort of ranking system along with it, because that's like the main thing that's missing in this game compared to a lot of other contemporary games is a quick game, something you can do easily and whenever you want. Because I don't have the same amount of time available. I don't have between 3 and 4 p.m. every single day available to play. Another reason why hopefully they change Fleet and take Crystal out of Fleet and put them someplace else. Anyway, I'm hopeful for some of those things happening this year, given the changes that they've made to raids, and with this latest TB, the time requirements. So we'll see what actually happens. Yeah, Calcestis is coming too. I don't really have any strong feelings about him to be a territory battle character. It'd be cool to have a new planet to check out, but what the actual rewards would be, who knows. Tuscan seemed pretty fun so far. I'm curious to have a 5v5 season, I think, to make them more interesting. We'll see how it goes. So thank you for listening. It's a long time. Not so bad. 42 minutes, 43 minutes, 42 minutes. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next month, and good luck with this season of GAC. Cheers.